Good day, everybody. Have you driven an electric vehicle yet? I must tell you, about 2 weeks ago, I took one for a test drive and I was deeply impressed. And considering I'm somewhat of a automotive traditionalist, that does say something. The topic of the conversation for this session is the automotive sector plan for EVs, electric vehicles, reality bites. If we put this in context, for over 100 years, we've had largely a single powertrain of the automotive industry. We are at an inflection point, tipping point, one could argue, that the shift in powertrain of your vehicle industry will have profound implications at every possible level of an automotive value chain. What is something we need to address urgently as a country, considering the strong manufacturing presence of OEMs, quite a strong embedded value chain, production, supply chain in South Africa, is how does the industry transform itself to keep pace with what are increasingly very accelerating technological developments in new energy vehicles or battery energy vehicles and powered vehicles in the automotive industry. I think this is something which is not just affecting consumers, people like ourselves, it's affecting companies, industries, and ultimately, as I allude to, will affect companies and countries as well. Joining us in the conversation here, we have a number of incredibly well qualified people. And I'm going to be talking to them in a very conversational format as to what does the future hold and what does the adoption of new powertrains, electric vehicles, hold out for the future manufacturing industry in our country and certainly in this part of the world, in Africa as well. Firstly, I'm not going to be too structured in the conversation, but what is a few months ago, I think it was from June, and Hiten, I'll come to you, Hiten Palmer, who's director of Ulilo Mobility Program at the University of Nelson Mandela University in Eastern Cape, is the DTIC, the Department of Trade of Industry and Competition, has launched a so-called green paper on electric vehicles. And I want your views first in terms of are we on track in terms of the vision thing as a country to start rethinking industrial policy around EVs? Just briefly, if I may, Hiten, before I ask you to kick off, is Hiten stands the lead executive, thought leader, and industry expert, extending over a decade and a half in the profession of automotive. He's a director of South Africa's National Electric Mobility Program, and he delivers to the mandate of enabling electric mobility across both the public as well as private sectors. Hiten, your views, green paper, I don't want to direct your introduction too much, but what are the where are we thinking, where's our government thinking about industrial policy for EVs going forward? Hiten, over to you.
Greetings all, and thank you, Martin, and pleasure to join everybody here today. As introduced, Hiten Palmer, Director of the Ulilo Electric Mobility Program. I think, from our activities for the last 8 years within the sector and developing the agenda on electric vehicles in South Africa, I think, Martin, you touched on it. What is the environment from government? What are the signals? Government has a role on creating the enabling environment. And in South Africa's case, there's a number of scenarios that we look at, from the emission profile. South Africa itself contributes 1.1% to global emissions. The energy sector is contributing 80% of that. And within the transport sector itself, 91.2% of emissions is within road transport. So setting that scene, South Africa, that's our status quo. So the automotive industry itself, it's been in existence since 1924. That started out in Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape, and it's grown to a significant industry where we are today. And a lot of that from a manufacturing space is highly centered around the internal combustion engine value chain. And I think it is what government's policy frameworks, extending on from 1924, that has developed the industry as well. Then we acknowledge the global move to new energy vehicles and specifically battery electric vehicle technology. And the context is how ready is South Africa to maintain its competitive advantage in its automotive industry to this context. So we acknowledge the automotive master plan that's got the vision to take the country to 2035 And within that is a shortfall on what are we going to do in South Africa to take us there. And I think this is where the new energy vehicles green paper that was released from the DTIC, aims to speak to that. So I think what it tries to acknowledge is, 5 pillars in terms of that. So it's looking at the lower or zero rated duty for EV components. And I think this is what is transitioning the value chain from component manufacturing, because that's where we need to transition our existing automotive industry from a manufacturing perspective. Then again, it's looking at the EV component structures on how we're going to incentivize that. And again, the sunset clauses on the various technologies. So try to create a leveling playing field. So currently, battery electric vehicles imported from the EU attract a 25% customs and import duty, where internal combustion is at 18%. So this is somewhat some of the frameworks that have been analyzed on status quo. And how do we try to create a leveling playing field on all technologies and drive the local market growth? And then it's looking at, somewhat on the ring fencing of the ecosystem of new energy vehicles, and then also looking at strengthening the value chain investment. So I think it's a first approach, in terms of that. I think, if we start unpacking it, how committed is it, in terms of that? And I think this is what is the first position out of the Automotive Master Plan that is now DTI has taken forward. So they put that out for public comment. They're currently capturing public comment. And I understand from the developments, it's going to be tabled at cabinet in the next few months. So I think this is the journey where we are. I think we would want to see a lot stronger agenda towards EVs. That's the personal opinion. And is that really being answered in the Auto Green Paper? I think there's still questions. Is that what is the outlook? What is the commitments? And I think these are the sort of things that are still need to be answered. So I think just broadly as an introduction to get the conversation going, those are initial comments to get it going.
Hidden, thank you very much. It's a great point. Thank you very much. Thanks for setting it out. Gail, coming to yourself, Gail, you're a senior economist at TIPS, Trade Investment Policy South Africa. This is sort of your day job. You guys do a lot of work in the automotive industry, of course, and you've been focusing your career a great deal about sort of green economy type issues. A quick question to yourself, Gail, and feel free just to, I was building on the conversation, what Hidden first mentioned. Hidden said that there needs to be, quote, a stronger agenda, stronger commitment, perhaps, by stakeholders, by the state in particular, about this thrust towards EV adoption, EV incentivization support. What should, beyond that existing green paper, what do you think could be what would best form part of a policy that would indicate stronger commitment from government's perspective? Galo?
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for the invitation. I think building on the green paper and what Hidden has highlighted, there's a clear kind of acknowledgement in government and in industry that the cost of doing nothing are extremely high. That would be really the end of our industry going forward. It won't happen overnight, but over a couple of decades, that would really impact negatively our industry, and even consumers, would be negatively impacted because we have to keep with global trends. If we really serious about driving electric vehicles, there's three key angles. The first one is we need to incentivize people to buy EVs. It has to be attractive for people to buy EVs. And the main problem is the cash cost, the actual capex that people have to pay, which is still quite high. So one of the things we've been looking at the moment with the DTIC and the automotive industry is the possibility of a cash grant system, potentially, that would incentivize buyers and particularly, structure it in a way that would support so-called at least entry to kind of intermediate level electric vehicles first, of course. And that's a big pillar. Of course, comes with this, a set of potential other incentives that you can have, but that capital expenditure is the biggest hurdle for most consumers or prospective consumers. Then, somewhat linked to that, the second angle is of course around charging infrastructure. Yeah. Arguably, in South Africa, we have a good amount of charging infrastructure if we compare that to the number of electric vehicles that we actually have in the country. But of course, they need to be visible, they need to be accessible, and people need to trust that they can use them. There's a really a lack of awareness when it comes to that. So making sure that we roll out infrastructure is important, both public and private infrastructure, so that we make really strong network of public infrastructure available, and that we support people into having their own infrastructure. I was quite striking, talking to one of the OEMs that does sell EVs in South Africa, indicating that more than 50% of the buyers of battery electric vehicles of that particular brand had a solar system at home. So it was quite striking for me, to start. Of course, quite upmarket in terms of the market segment, but nonetheless. And then the third element is the manufacturing element, the value chain. How we support our value chain to grow, not at the expense of the existing value chain, but complementarily. In the short term, if we're talking soft hybrids or plug-in hybrids, actually it only adds components effectively to a car. So in the coming kind of decade, if we're talking about manufacturing soft hybrid and plug-in hybrid, we can fairly quickly and fairly easily adapt. Of course, the big shift is when we move to full battery electric vehicles, and here we're going to need to look at the APDP, the automotive support program, and tweak that, particularly for, again, capital expenditure, capital investment by the OEM, so that they can adapt the factory line to move from ICE to EVs. So these are, in a nutshell, as a way of kind of introduction, the three key areas that I think need to be looked at. Yes.
Gelo, thank you very much. Kalani, coming to yourself, Kalani Mapakwa, you are CEO of Blackstone Consulting. You do a lot of work in all things engineering type sectors, but what Gelo mentioned is that the cost of doing nothing will certainly be, let me put a phrase, as Gelo said, will be structural decline of the industry, putting it quite frankly. But which comes first here? Will this be regulator driven, or will it be consumer driven? Because clearly it's not being consumer driven. The amount of electrical vehicles or EVs on the roads in South Africa are minuscule, to say the least. So therefore, it must be regulator driven. But is there a real possibility here that if there's insufficient consumer uptake, despite possible state support going forward or incentivization going forward, that we have a very real threat of being technologically left behind in a very dramatic fashion? Kalani?
The business always will be worried about offsetting the costs for business, for doing business in terms of locations. And I think for me, obviously, the businesses will be concerned in terms of crossing over to EVs. What are the incentives, that will be put in place in terms of offsetting the costs to do business in the space of EVs? And I think location, obviously, as well with our SEZ. I think we have a number of SEZ in the country that makes it very opportune to have attraction for investors to come through for the EVs. But to just affirm what Doc has touched on in terms of regulation, I believe as well that regulation should be the driver, because if you leave it to consumers, I think then we might find the industry at large in trouble in terms of the switch to EVs, because the uptake is going to take a gradual movement. It won't be very much on a spike. When it comes to localization, I think then localization needs to be supported by ensuring we have the SEZs, the economic zone, special economic zones, and also ensure our terrain that talks to export, which is our ports. We have all that area sorted. I think some of the challenges that we've experienced recently as a country in terms of our ports have not given confidence. And I think those are some of the issues that need to be worked out with speed to enable this area of EVs to develop quicker in terms of attracting investments. And for me,
sorry, let me to interject and ask you folks on SEZs. So the one SEZ we've been hearing so much about in recent months has been that in Silverton, in Roslyn rather, in Gauteng, and really focusing on the sizable investment announced and now being rolled out by Ford in terms of production capacity and largely export driven. Can you just talk to the specifics, perhaps, of, you mentioned SEZs as sort of catalysts, if you will, industrial catalysts for automotive value chain. What are the specifics, and what sort of incentives does the state have to provide to retain or expand an OEM investment? That's the current situation, and what incentives do you think will be required going forward as the powertrain shifts? And what are these investors like Ford, amongst others, actually seeking from the government, from the state, to subsidize this transition going forward?
Thanks, Stuart. I think with the SEZ, it always gives an opportunity to get a number of incentives that talk to your utilities. It gives, in terms of positioning, I mean, Gauteng, in terms of global positioning, it makes it easy for Ford to have their plant expansion nearby, so that you have your logistics in terms of your just-in-time, logistics, and also your integrated production management systems. They will be easy to talk to each other if you have localization there. So I think when it comes to the incentives schemes, I think always it is about the offsetting of attracting investors from other regions and other areas and other towns to move to this town, to this particular SEZ, because it will be competitive in terms of rates that it will offer to the potential investors. And it has always been one of the ways, Martin, that as allocations allowed that a lot of OEMs make it easy for them to make a decision to come to invest in South Africa, particularly in this case. And with that SEZ being there, with the investment that came from Ford, we saw already we have 1,200 jobs that are going to be created. So I guess it becomes a package whereby it assists in terms of aligning with the imperatives of government job creation, in terms of industrialization as well, because it opens up all the funding access that comes from the Black Industrialist Program and other competitive environment schemes, CEP programs, Automotive Investment Scheme, AIS. So there are all these number of incentives that the government is always projecting to share with the industry to make it easy for industry to do business. It makes it even more easily packageable when they are tied to the SEZ. Okay, so I think that creates,
Absolutely. Andre, coming to yourself, you're an industry specialist sitting in the research team of Standard Bank. Something which, and talking to your expertise, which is really not just South Africa, but the region, is African economies, let's say north of South Africa and south of Morocco, are not plugged in at all to the industrial value chain, with very few small exceptions, perhaps Kenya, but certainly consumers of pre-owned vehicles. When we're looking at this dramatic technological shift, this is a tough sort of leading question to you. The African Association of Auto Manufacturers has been doing a lot of work around trying to create industrial clusters to sort of replicate almost the long-term policy experience in South Africa, which Kalani sort of alludes to. But what does this transition towards new powertrains, electric vehicles, actually mean for a continent that is so ill-prepared to take advantage of this shift in automotive production and technological adoption? Any thoughts, Andre?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. You're right. South Africa is definitely the most industrialized country in the area you described, and the other parts are definitely on their way but certainly nowhere near the sort of the level of grid energy production or even industrial production that South Africa has. But any change, brings opportunities. And I'd love to tell you about my favorite business model in the automotive sector, which comes from NIO in China. And they sell you the electric vehicle without the battery. Right? It sounds crazy, but of course the battery is the most expensive part. And that makes the upfront payment much more affordable. Right? So these are the kinds of things we need to think about. We've seen the same with decentralized energy production. People putting panels on their roof. Cheaper solutions is what sub-Saharan Africa needs, and creative solutions. So you get the car, you don't get the battery. So what happens? You lease the battery, right? Which you can upgrade over time. Perfect for Africa. Your seats will be old, your gearbox will be old, but the battery might be new. At the moment in China, it costs about $1,200 per year to lease it. You can buy it as well. But right now, you just drive into a swap station. It takes 10 minutes to swap the battery around. These are the kinds of things we need to be aware of in sub-Saharan Africa, because we don't have legacy systems in many countries. We're open space. We don't know if this will become popular, but that's the kind of creative thinking that I love about industries that are changing fast and throwing off these ideas. I wish my phone had that kind of option. I wish I could lease a battery for my home solar setup. I've got two, and I'd love a third one. So the level of interest we're seeing in electric vehicles today and from other people is astonishingly high. I'm really glad about that, and I hope we can extend that to the topics that other speakers have raised. South Africa's manufacturing, our exports of cars, the network of charging stations, even to ad valorem import taxes. We need to think about these things. About 4 million electric vehicles will be made this year. Very few of those in sub-Saharan Africa, as you point out. South Africa does make, we make hybrids. The C180 Mercedes is a hybrid. We do make those. But by the end of this decade, by say 2030, about 36 million new energy vehicles will be made in 1 year, if we assume that 40% of all cars will be electric. So South Africa at the moment, we produce about 600,000 vehicles. So we're not amongst the largest producers, but we're significant. And certainly as an analyst, we think a lot about how will electric vehicles change the world that we live in? How will it affect other industries? How will it affect the broader auto industry, but also broader mobility? How will it affect retail? And then now we're at a point where the electric vehicle shift is inevitable. Right? I don't think any analyst is arguing maybe, let's see, it's inevitable. So now the time has come for us to shift that question around, right? We need to shift, and the question we must ask is, how will other industries affect electric vehicles? How will the price of lithium for batteries affect electric vehicles? How will state subsidies affect electric vehicles? But we know South Africa does not have a lot of cash for that at the moment. How will the price of steel or the price of anything related to automotive labor, how will interest rates affect electric vehicles? And that's where I think the most exciting questions are. And hopefully today we can go through some of those, Martin.
Andre, great. Thanks. Great comments. Thank you. We're talking about Africa, just moving north. Tolu Olokokun, you're sitting in Nigeria today. You're the founder of a company called Think Electric. I spent a lot of time in Nigeria doing work actually in the automotive industry, and we proposed, we were talking about electric vehicles, but this goes back 3 years perhaps in Nigeria, but as is the case in many countries in our region, there's policy proposals, but policy implementation is a very different thing. Tolu, your views around EVs in Nigeria, are we getting ahead of ourselves? What's your view up from West Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. And I want to congratulate South Africa for the great paper. I hope it has the touch of all the stakeholders in the EV industry for the paper to really come to play. When it comes to Nigeria, well, a lot is at stake, policies are made not with the context of what we have within the country. Most policies are adopted from other nations. So if you look at most automotive policies we are having, even right now, you will see that it's related to what we have in Ghana, what we have in Kenya, and all of that. So we don't have this customization that has to do with our own peculiarities within the country. So majorly, we don't have policies that are made in-house for us to be able to move ahead and implement. And when it comes to new energy vehicles, the electric vehicle, a lot of people here still don't know what that is. And during the 8th Assembly, one of the senators proposed the banning of petrol cars, and the whole house went agog against him, like Nigeria is an oil-producing country. We must do everything to frustrate the sales of electric cars in our country. I mean, that was the then Senate president, or the deputy Senate president. So it was appalling, and that was what brought up some people like me and the organization that I represent, which is Think Electric Africa. So what we do is to demonstrate that electric vehicle is actually possible, and we can do it. And we started with the conversion of existing petrol cars, and we've been able to capture people's mind, the media, and all of that along the way. So what we do at Think Electric Africa majorly is to train, do research, and see how we can use the little resources we have within the country to bring electric vehicle into play. Right now, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Think Bikes, a micro-mobility company where we manufacture cargo bikes and road bikes locally. Now, so as a country, our policymakers needs to be more educated. So we must go in the area of advocacy and education for these people, because the kind of policy they make doesn't look implementable, because it doesn't favor the new transition. Now, last year, Hyundai unveiled an electric vehicle, Hyundai Kona, which is the first OEM assembled electric car in Nigeria, and the price tag was at 24 million naira. That cannot, help the adoption, the rate of adoption of electric vehicle that we're making.
Give us a price of that in US dollars, sorry, Tolu, 24 million
That's in
naira.
naira. That's about $60,000. That's about $60,000.
Okay,
So I'm one of the people that rose up to tell them, nah, this is not what we really need. If you look at Africa, the terrain generally, you will see that where electric vehicle will be most impacted, where we need electric vehicle much more, is in mass transit, is in mass transportation. So the government should be looking at bringing electric buses, electric tricycles, things that works well, because a lot of people cannot afford even the regular ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine, let alone the most expensive electric cars. So the price tag doesn't favor the transition. Now, if the government would do a lot, we would like the government to look into mass transportation, bring these BRT buses that are electric based into the country, and start working on it. And that's why I want to support one of the three focal points Gator raised. One of it is to incentivize the system, and beyond that, we need to also incorporate a kind of financial model so that the system can finance people that want to go into this new energy, into this electric vehicle. I mean, to buy this electric vehicle. So you're looking at, okay, paying for a vehicle over 24 months or 36 months.
Got it, totally got it, understood. Of course, financing is a major constraint, of course, on be it electric or any vehicles. But let me ask you a quick question, a very specific one. We've seen, again, the good work done by the AAAM, as I mentioned earlier. There's been a lot of discussions with Nigeria over the years, led by a number of the OEMs initially. And we've seen a nascent industrial hub emerge in Ghana, but not Nigeria. There seems to be a lot more policy agility in Nigeria in terms of creating or appealing to a number of anchor OEMs. and starting to develop at the early stages of a more employment-creating, value-adding value chain around that in Ghana. How's Nigeria responding, be it for internal combustion engines, ICE engines, or for EVs perhaps? Any views?
Well, the issue is that the automotive policy in Nigeria is still not being implemented, and that's one of the things the stakeholders are agitating for. And I know the current NADDC Director General is actually doing a lot to push for it, going around to support the manufacturers, the OEMs we have locally, and to support them in one way or the other. Now, if we look at what Ghana is doing, quite a lot of policies are progressive in Ghana, though they are related to what we have in Nigeria, but they are progressive. Number one, they are having tax cuts in production, so which encourages a lot of manufacturers within, and also we're looking at the other enabling environment like electricity generation, and I think at the point Ghana was having excess generation, and they are even trying to discourage renewable energy so that they could sell their excess generation of electricity. When Nigeria is not even having enough, we are supposed to be generating something around 200,000 megawatt, and we're having less than 4,000 megawatt right now. This doesn't help manufacturing, the industry, So everything is at stake here. If you will do, if you will manufacture, if you are in your industry, you are spending a lot on electricity, on import duties, on taxes, and all of that. So it doesn't encourage whether you want to go into any kind of manufacturing. And so many companies are even moving out of Nigeria, as we say. So for this to be reversed, I think the government needs to look inward and start implementing things that will encourage investors and manufacturers to thrive within. That's when we can now say, okay, let Nigeria be manufacturing so components to even export to other countries. Within, while we are talking with electric vehicle enthusiasts, because we have a particular forum for all Africans where we talk about electric vehicle, we keep shouting South Africa is doing great, Rwanda is doing great, Kenya is also trying. But Nigeria, we just call ourselves giant of Africa. We are not implementing things that will really move us forward.
I think this is it, Tolu, this is it. I mean, the differentiator in emerging Africa is countries that can implement rather than just talk about policies, not so.
Yeah.
Can I move on perhaps? Can I move on perhaps? Coming back to Hiten. Hiten, just an article I must quote recently from the Financial Times, and it's quoting Morgan Stanley. And they quote by 2030, Morgan Stanley's global automotive team expects that 40% of new car sales will be electric globally. Achieving this level of EV adoption will require 36, as Andre said earlier, 36 million electric cars to be produced every year by the turn of the next decade, up from 4 million expected to be made this year. Now, this clearly is dramatic hit, and something which concerns me a great deal. We all talk about opportunity and job creation, but looking at the value chain of automotive components manufacturers in South Africa now, the fact is electric vehicles don't have that many components. So how will this transition from a state perspective? This is incredibly, I'm using a very much overused word here, disruptive to the industry. Of course, it's enabling, but it's very disruptive to vested industrial interests. How do we as a state think through this, the value chain? It's all very well getting OEMs making EVs for export, that's great, but what implications, I believe they'll be severe, will there be for the local value chain of component manufacturers in South Africa? Hiten, your views?
Yeah, good point there that you raised, Martin. I think, when we look at this, the disruption that's coming, are you going to be part of the wave or get disrupted? And I think this is where it is. So looking at the automotive industry, as some of the panelists have announced and touched on briefly, I mean, pre-COVID, 6.9% to GDP and production in the 600,000, in terms of that. So it's a significant share. And the question and some of the work was looking at, out of the vehicles that we manufacture, 60% of those are exported to the EU, and EU is starting to ban ICEs from as 2025, from that. So we're going to lose our principal markets of export. So the question is, how are we going to transition towards it? How are we going to maintain our competitive advantage and even grow to the target of 1% of global production by 2035, within the Automotive Master Plan? It's a huge task, it's ambitious. We'll get there. So I think the key thing is how we're going to transition through that. And I think this is what is looking at, how we're going to grow the value chain, looking at EV charging equipment, looking at component production within the components for EVs. And we understand, as you touched on, there are slightly less components within EVs itself, but how are we going to capitalize along that? I think Transport and Environment released an earlier study within EU, you touched on it, jobs. 1 million jobs to be created across the EV value chain by 2030 in the EU. So I think this is the context. We've got this challenge. There's the disruption coming. How are we going to take advantage of that? And I think this is what we need to take, look into it. I think the EV agenda is not just about the vehicles. We need to take an ecosystem approach. And I think this is what we've started to unpack. It's really about unlocking the energy sector, looking at the grid infrastructure, looking at the standards, the charging equipment, and those sort of approach. So, I think this is what is key to unlock, and how we're going to take South Africa and unlock the competitive advantage across the EV ecosystem. Because when you look at battery production, it is not only for vehicles, it's complementary to the energy sector as well. Currently, lithium-ion batteries imported into South Africa are zero rated at customs duty. So, the earlier panelists also touched on this context about the battery leasing, that sort of thing. So when we start looking at these, there are some sort of frameworks in place. When we're looking at Africa perspective, the Southern African community, SADC region, is endowed with the mineral wealth that is already supplying the global community. The question is, how are we going to unlock that for Africa in terms of that? So we've got a long road ahead, not only South Africa, but Africa as well. The question is, how are we going to drive the political will to really unlock both battery production, which will not only complement the automotive industry, but also support the energy sector as well. These are the challenges that lie ahead, and we need to bring the political will, to start unlocking this green agenda, from that, which is complementary to energy and the automotive sector as well. So it is a challenge, but we need to start looking at, from a regional perspective, how we're going to get there. So I think what is key is government, and we need the correct signals from government in terms of the political will to unlock this and create the enabling environment in each region in terms of that. And I think, looking at the automotive industry in South Africa, the component industry under NACAM, they've got a significant member base there, as well as employment levels, in terms of that, over and above the OEMs themselves. And I think the key work that's required is looking at how are they going to transform in terms of that. I think it's not taking a resistive approach, but a proactive approach. So how are we going to transform and move within it? Because I also touched on the mineral wealth. These are the things, the opportunities, but it is a challenge. The question is, how are we going to work collectively? What is government going to do from that? I think there's a pillar within the Auto Green paper that's been released on the component aspect, but still we need to question that. What is going to be that, where the government's going to look at trying to create a better incentive, on EV component production, because that's what's going to drive the OEMs and the component manufacturing industry to start looking at that. Because I think what's key amongst the multinationals is how is South Africa going to create the enabling environment for it to transition across the value chain. I think that's what's key.
Andre, coming to yourself, Hiten has set out all the immense challenges we face here. We have the Eskom situation. We have infrastructural deficits, not just about power, but charging infrastructure is mentioned. We have vested interests around energy, particularly energy, fossil fuels in South Africa and the region. We have consumers are not terribly interested, at least, or incentivized to be able to afford electric vehicles. And this is a myriad of very complex issues. How do we start to, we know what the challenges are, but it takes bold policy and very brave implementation to be able to transform and really implement a new thinking around industrial policy here. Can you comment on that, and where do we start?
Well, Martin, let's look at one of the real great positives. Investors are far ahead of policymakers in some senses. Today, Tesla is worth $1 trillion. Nobody made a policy about that. People with cash and businesses, pension funds have put money into that. And they are essentially funding the expansion of electric vehicles via Tesla. And it's different all over the world, certainly in China, in Europe. We must never forget about investors putting money into this. I'll tell you an interesting story. In London, they had an electric truck company listing on the stock exchange. It became the biggest listing ever because it was electric trucks. They hadn't made a cent of revenue. Okay, investors are willing to take the risk on this one, and all of that equity gets put to use, paying people salaries, going into research, establishing business models, building charging stations. Of course, it has to be allied with policy, but I can tell you, most of the story right now is led by investors. The problem comes in is this equity is going into these companies, lots of EV firms, and many of us will have heard that Tesla and other electric vehicle companies are worth more than all the others combined. Astonishing statistics on that one, and that's because investors are willing to put money behind those. So that's certainly a big positive. The other positive is on consumers. It's true that consumers, are reluctant to buy a product that is more expensive than what they're getting now, even though it could work out cheaper over the long term. But consumers are also voters, and voters have shown that they are willing to vote for governments who will make climate commitments, and those climate commitments will either incentivize EVs or ban internal combustion vehicles. So, consumers have two aspects to them. They're also voters. The other astonishingly positive thing is the level of research and development that is still going on. The propulsion change is only the latest, and we've seen changes to safety systems, to tires, to gearboxes, and the amount that BMW and Ford and Volkswagen spend every year on research and development is astonishing. It's like 20 times more than Tesla and the electric vehicles companies are spending. So once the R&D comes through from the electric vehicle manufacturers, I think we'll see much more positive news on that side, and that investment I think will be positive for all of us, even though there are all those challenges that you mentioned. And Martin, can I just end on one more challenge that some of us might have forgotten about? So in South Africa, if you look at our budget, the budget for 21-22 is a number of 83 billion rand in there. That's the general fuel levy that the government expects to receive. Okay, so that is 6% of all revenue that the government receives. They spend about 1.7 trillion rand a year. So we must never forget that the tax that government will lose when we start buying less fuel. It may take many years, but that's certainly important. Also, the tax that we would lose if we incentivize imports of, for example, electric vehicles. So the just transition you mentioned is not just about consumers, it's about government as well. And we need well-financed governments to be able to implement policy.
No, Andre, very, very true. I think there's two key points you make there, which should really remain with us. One is capital is already ahead of capital leads policy here. I think that's very true. And secondly is that let's call it the brutal economics of EV adoption on the fiscus and Treasury's income, because that is at 83 billion rand. I didn't know that figure is indeed significant, and that's a tax windfall that would certainly be under threat if, as EVs become more and more prevalent in our economy and society. And it talks to, it's not just a new ecosystem of revenue, it's also how the state thinks about collecting revenue from this new ecosystem of EVs that, using your word, is inevitable, seemingly. Kalani, coming to yourself, and I like this word inevitable because one of the key sort of obstacles of people buying EVs has been so-called range anxiety, particularly in a country that has a very big geography. It talks to lack of charging infrastructure, long-distance driving, power outages, blackouts, load shedding, whatever it may be, and this causes range anxiety. Nobody wants to be in an EV on a highway and stuck. There's obviously no solution here. But we've seen something very interesting happen in the last few weeks. We see it we've seen very dramatic reports out of the UK of long queues of vehicles queuing for fuel, for petrol, in light of shortages. We have not too dissimilar, but not as dramatic fuel shortages because of supply chain disruptions in continental Europe. And an article came out very recently of fuel rationing in China as well because of these supply side shocks. So now, literally in the last few weeks, the range anxiety now applies to internal combustion engines and not EVs, particularly in markets like the UK, amongst others. So in light of that, do you think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, do you think that this tipping point of EV adoption has now been dramatically accelerated, excuse the pun, because of range anxiety is now in the minds of people who fill their cars or vehicles, trucks, whatever it may be, with petrol or diesel, rather than those who can comfortably charge their vehicle when they choose to? Kalani, your views on that?
Thank you, Doc. Well, I think it's an interesting take because it's always going to be interesting that, as I think our colleague has mentioned, there is a lot of attraction to EVs. I think everybody would like to see EVs. And I think one of the things definitely would be, the concern. I mean, I'm traveling 1,100 kilometers to go home from here. So I wouldn't want to get stuck in the middle of nowhere with family. And I think it would definitely necessitate to have, a lot of these infrastructure challenges mitigated timeously. And you are right with the anxiety that is happening with the fuel shortages. Definitely, we are exposed to that risk in South Africa. And again, I think it goes back to one of the colleagues has mentioned, whenever we have chaos in terms of the new introduction, it is probably a good time to switch over to the next generation of cars, which is the EVs. So I think this anxiety presents an opportune time for more consumers to think more about EVs than they did before, because then they can see that it is probably timeous exercise, that it is inevitable, as you mentioned, that we have to switch over to these vehicles, and these vehicles then they might give us a much more value than we had been having from the fuel vehicles. But the big issue that you touched on for me still remains that how do we create that balance for government to find an alternative funding model when they're going to cease getting money from the fuel that they are charging, in terms of, they introduced the tax, remember, in terms of emissions for the carbon emissions for vehicles with a sticker that has to show that your vehicle is compliant. So all these levies that they would be losing, I guess, also becomes part of this, conundrum to say, how do we promote these EVs and how do we incentivize consumers so that we cushion the consumer to see the attraction towards these new EVs and feel comfortable that they are affordable, they are accessible, and make it sort of more of a viability for them. So I guess it's a collaboration of the industry and government, but the consumer, for me, is going towards that direction, Doc, of moving, towards that to the EV because of this anxiety.
Sorry to interrupt. Maybe we'll have Andre's favorite car, the Neo, sometime soon on South African roads, considering the high entry cost of current EVs. The starting cost is something around 600,000 Rand or slightly more. Maybe the era of more sort of lower cost, cheaper EVs is what's required, perhaps coming out of Asia or other OEMs, perhaps, of how we start to think about, or how to start to satisfy consumer tastes who may want to buy an EV but simply can't afford to. And that talks also to the point earlier that was raised by Tolu around affordability. Gaylor, coming to yourself, recent weeks, the news has been dominated by COP26, Glasgow, and climate change pressures and the like. The global automotive industry accounts for 9% apparently of carbon emissions globally. What do you expect to come out? And of course, the timing of this conversation is very good. But what do you think going forward? Is we'll see, of course, in Glasgow, everyone will be driving electric vehicle. They should actually be riding bicycles or walking. But what do you think what do you expect to come out of COP26? And how will governments, particularly ours, react to that in the context of EV production and adoption?
Right. Yes, Martin. I mean, thanks. Of course, the COP26 has been on everyone's mind. For me, it was quite striking, that from a South African perspective, going to COP, there were three main areas that the South African government went to COP26 to raise funding from. One, of course, we talked about it briefly, Eskom, the transition at Eskom, and that is tied as well to the transition to immobility, as we discussed, around anxiety about the ability to charge your vehicle and so forth. The second one, green hydrogen. Really a big transition around industrial structures, but again, tying to EVs as well, particularly with hydrogen fuel cells vehicles that are really set to also come forward, certainly on buses and trucks, or fixed route fleets, and where they're a lot more competitive than battery electric vehicles, certainly. And then the third area, squarely on e-mobility, electric vehicles, and really to look at how to spur the market, for consumers, and then for our industries. So for me, it's quite clear that with COP26, the message is loud and clear. The question is not whether or not we're going to transition to e-mobility. The question is how fast. And coming out of Europe and the UK, it's quite clear that we're heading towards a transition where ICE are irrelevant and out of our roads, largely by 2035. Certainly, the sales of new ICE will be largely out by 2035. That is fairly quick, if you consider that for the production life cycle of a vehicle, depending on OEMs, 7 to 8 years. So we're basically talking at 2 vehicle production life cycles, and we have now in 2035 completely dramatically changed vehicle market. So that doesn't give actually that much time to adapt. Of course, as we've discussed, the soft hybrid, plug-in hybrid is much easier to adapt to, but full battery and hydrogen vehicles are a different story. Similarly, we need to think about, as it was mentioned by Andre and Kalani, around the government infrastructure and the government funding. But we must be reminded that it's two sides of the same story. Yes, less government revenues on tax, but fuel is the largest import. The cost of health of impact is staggering. The cost of environmental damage is staggering. And we still have vast amount of fossil fuel subsidies in the system that need to be removed. So altogether, we may actually well be coming out stronger. Of course, some parts of the system would lose out, and that has to be balanced. But we may well come out much stronger in the long run on a financial basis. And at the same time, and my last point, it is cheaper to run an EV. So we could expect, more disposable income for households, more spending. That then brings more, VAT and so forth. So we need to look at a complex and comprehensive picture to try and have a bit of a net understanding. But I think in the long run, it's quite clear that acting and being proactive really will maximize the benefits and will come out stronger in the future.
Gelo, thank you. Our time is up, I'm afraid. So just to briefly conclude, can I just ask each of you in 20 seconds, literally 20 seconds, to give us what's the highlight of the, what's the one key thing that you think is the most important, and it's a big question, around EV adoption, EV going forward in the context of South Africa or perhaps Africa? Tolu, to yourself, please, your one highlight of EV adoption going forward. What is the opportunity? What is the challenge? What's your one takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big opportunity for Africa because we're starting from, let's say, zero. So we have the opportunity to get it right. And one big thing is that we must localize it. I mean, make sure we do not rely so much on the Western world, because the Africa has the market. I mean, imagine the amount of population we have in Africa generally. So the opportunity is enormous because, number one, we've not had this industry in the time past so much. Now we are going to transition to sustainability, green environment, and all of that. And because of that, we are able to put our people to good jobs, and we can start with a clean sheet. And in the world map, Africa has like 1% of the buying strength, the purchasing power of new electric vehicles. I mean, new vehicles generally. So this is the time to make a mark and have some market share. So the opportunity is enormous. We should look inward, get investors in, and try to do things for ourselves. That would be my take. Thank you very much.
Tolu, thank you. I look forward to driving an electric car next time I'm in Lagos. Thank you. Hiten, your one takeaway from this conversation, please.
Yeah, so I think the discussions have been good, just getting the various viewpoints and the regional perspective as well. I think while there are challenges, there are opportunities. I think what we acknowledge as well, similarly within the telecommunications industry in Africa and how that grew, mobile payment and all of those sort of things, which is now being embraced internationally. These are the opportunities that are available for Africa and South Africa as well. The question is, how ready is each region, each country going to be able to adapt and transition and grab that opportunity? So I think this is what's key. Political will is a key agenda to drive the industry. I think financing was also touched on earlier, and investors. So the private sector will be moving in that front. But I think collectively, government and industry need to play a collective approach. And I think it's exciting times. There's an opportunity, and look forward to seeing how this market evolves. Thanks.
And thank you. Thanks for that. Kolani, your one takeaway?
Thank you, Doc. Thanks to the panel, the insights shared. I think my sentiment as we close is just to say, if we have sustainable thinking from the leadership at government, at business sector forums, in terms of, I think my colleague shared previous to say, this is a cause and effect. When we go EV, we're improving the conditions in terms of the green economy that we're going for, in terms of lives, in terms of health. So I think there's a cause and effect approach that we must think in terms of integrated thinking. But for me, sustainability should be the way we should be thinking when we do these initiatives and these programs. It's about the next future. How do we develop a future that is better for our country? So sustainability thinking for me. And then the other part for me, Doc, just to close off, is the agility, the speed of adoption. I think also goes hand in hand with that, to say the speed of adoption as a country, we could be a reference point for others to understand how it is done and how well it is done. So I think those were the two key words for me from our discussion today. Thank you very much.
Kalani, I like that. Thank you. Gelo, your takeaways?
Yeah, I think fascinating discussion. And in terms of my last point, for me, it's striking that in Africa we have significant transportation needs. We have among the best renewable energy potential. We have the minerals to produce all of this. From a battery, from an EV, from a renewable energy perspective. The opportunity is here, really is here. We need to seize it to make sure that the continent is not left behind once more when it comes to this transition. So it comes down to implementation. Let's get started, however small, and then it will snowball effectively. And then that's when we can embark on the transition to immobility and more broadly to more sustainable development going forward.
Gerard, thanks so much for your time. Thank you. Andre, the final word goes to you.
Thanks, Martin. The petrol-powered hatchback does not have a monopoly on mobility. A big dusty bus does not have a monopoly on mobility. People want to be mobile, goods need to be delivered, and people are prepared to pay for that. So we should be open to achieving mobility. People need to get where they want to safely and affordably. I cannot build a refinery in my backyard. None of us can. They cost billions of dollars, and very often they're a failure. But I can put solar panels up on my roof. I produced about 8 or 9 units, kilowatt hours yesterday, which is more than enough to power to fill the battery on a car. You simply cannot do that with carbon-based fuel. So no need to stand in a line, no need to jump up and down to go to your local petrol station. You can do it on your own roof. And if you get stuck in the middle of nowhere, there's always someone there. And I would love to see people putting up solar panels, and I could pay them for the power they would sell to me. What a great business transaction. Let's hope that happens.
Andre, thank you. And you talked to so many things. All of you talked to so many things. Words I'm here. My sort of summary conclusion of this. It's energy just transition. We hear about Andre talk about liberalization, effectively of the power grid. Really, it's about industrial policy. Gail, as you mentioned, Africa missed out on the previous industrial revolution. My sense is the new industrial revolution is upon us, and it's going to be powered differently. We need to have, using your word, Kalani, agility to sort of really embrace this. Tolu is you talk about the implementation requirement. We need the vision thing, the vision thing, the focus thing. Focus really is to understand what is really taking place and how rapidly this technological shift is taking place. And as you allude to, Andre, it's not just about vehicles and cars. It's a much wider sort of energy mobility ecosystem that really will political economies that get this right now will certainly thrive for decades to come. Those which get this, those that don't, will wither and structurally decline. And I think that's a point where we are, and we really need to be very, very serious as to how we consider this point of this conversation. And I use the word, it's an imperative for all of you. Thank you very much, everybody. Much appreciated. Thank you to all of you for your valuable time. Thank you to the Factory Harbour team for putting us together and bringing us together. My name, as you know, is Martin Davis from Deloitte, and it's been a pleasure hosting. Thank you very much.